Hey everybody. I recently ran into a Mike Winger video that was actually tolerably concise. Crazy, right? So what's this all about, Mike?
I was challenged by my friend Tim Barnett from the YouTube channel Red Pin Logic to answer in 3 minutes or less 10 atheist objections to belief in God. In fact, this comes from a YouTube comment from an atheist named Brian Doyle, who says that this is 10 ways to prove that a God does not exist.
So I guess concise for Mike means he's making a 6-minute video to complete a 3-minute response challenge. Well, no biggie. I'm sure he'll do a good job. And by good job, I mean bad job.
You know it's an atheist because he puts God in lowercase g unnecessarily just to get you.
Yes, just to get you. You know someone's deep into fundamentalism when they take basic adherence to common usage as a jab against their religion. And that's ignoring that the person said, a God, which I don't even think most Christians would capitalize. Yowzers. Chill, Mike.
So I accepted Tim's challenge to try to, in 3 minutes or less, do this. He's going to do it on his channel as well.
Yeah, and I'd suggest you go check it out if Mike's not condescending enough for you. The guy even grades people he responds to with a red pen. Like, really? That's even starting to fall out of favor within education. And you're going to mark up grown adults you're supposed to be having a dialogue with?
Here's my attempt to diffuse the atheist bomb in 3 minutes, 10 reasons that you would stop being a believer in God. Let's see if I can do this and keep us all from becoming atheists in the next 3 minutes. Because I'm pretty sure if I can't answer these things in 3 minutes or less, the atheist bomb will blow up and we will all become atheists.
I get that he's being snarky here, but even on a humor level... Sorry, let me try that again. Even on a humor level, he's just thoroughly misunderstanding atheism and its relationship to religious belief. Christians are already aware of plenty of good reasons to doubt, and they've learned to cope with them using a lot of deeply internalized psychological defenses. This is so common that struggling with a faith is a regular part of Christian vernacular. So the suggestion that any set of arguments could bypass those defenses and suddenly turn all Christians atheists is silly. And yes, to reiterate, I know he's joking. But his sarcasm seems predicated on the idea that these objections, even in theory, might instantly destroy Christianity if only they were good enough. And that just shows an amazing lack of insight into what actually holds people in Christianity and what's involved in dragging former believers out of it. It makes me wonder if Mike even understands his audience well enough to be of any real help to them.
And to read the objections, allow me to introduce my improvisational atheist friend, Mick.
Oh, jeez.
10 ways to prove that a God does not exist.
Yeah, I didn't know exactly what to expect, and somehow that still felt like exactly what I was expecting.
Let's get started. Number 1. The fact that a human being has to tell you about the existence of your God proves there is no God. We would be born with knowledge of its existence.
Okay, so Brian overplays his hand by saying this proves no God exists. Something he'll do a lot, sorry Brian if you're watching. But the point should still be clear. He's suggesting God should be an evident part of our daily experience all our lives going back to birth. Kinda like our parents. Even if it doesn't disprove God, this is a meaningful thing to consider. So let's see how deeply Mike considers it.
Babies aren't born knowing anything at all. How strange to suppose they will be born knowing about God.
So, he zeroes in on the word born in order to nitpick the semantics of how much we know as infants. Great. That's simply not the point of what Brian was saying, any more than me saying my kids have known me from birth is about how much knowledge they had of me in the delivery room. That's just incredibly silly.
But research has shown that humans are predisposed to believe in supernatural agency behind the world. God belief will crop up in humans unless indoctrination pushes it out. So by your own standard, Brian, this is actually evidence for God.
No. It's just an indication that humans are prone to superstition. It's weird that Mike would put so many of his chips on a primal instinct we know leads us to be mistaken just because it's universal. And even weirder that he'd call our attempt to correct for it indoctrination. But even granting Mike's assumptions, this still wouldn't even begin to address the actual concern. We could all have this kind of vague sense of divinity and still not know the God of Christianity and still go to hell. So where did that even get you?
Number 2, a God belief is simply geography. Being raised in a religious home decides which God you believe in. What surprises me with this one is that it's based on an official logical fallacy called the genetic fallacy. Basically, you can't prove a belief wrong by criticizing where it came from, Richard Dawkins.
Apologists have a really bad habit of overdiagnosing the genetic fallacy. But the explanation of why is boring and complicated, so I'm just going to put it on the screen and in the description. Now in this case, it would be a genetic fallacy to say the cultural origins of religion prove God doesn't exist. However, this doesn't cancel out the fact that different cultures developing entirely different ideas about God is a strong indication that religious knowledge is based on, let's just be extremely generous and say suspect methodology. Also, the idea that God lets almost all the cultures be mistaken about him is more than a little problematic, at least for Christians. When you just dismiss these issues because they don't technically disprove God in absolute terms, you look like an unserious thinker who's not interested in wrestling with them. And if that's all you plan to do, blurting out the name of a logical fallacy just makes you sound like a smartass.
What's equally embarrassing for those who hold to number 2 is that by their own standard, their atheism is just a result of where they were born, and therefore they can't be trusted about atheism. So it's fallacious and self-refuting.
This has to be one of the worst I know you are, but what am I's I've ever heard.
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
Yeah, being born in X location might make you more likely to become atheist as surely as being born in Y location might make you more likely to become Christian. But this superficial observation misses pretty much the entire point, which is that religions are distributed across the world as if the knowledge proposed by each one arose from the imagination of a specific culture and depends entirely on that culture to keep passing it down to future generations. You need a specific culture to teach you about Christianity. You need a specific culture to teach you about Hinduism. You could never just go learn the tenets of any religion without this instruction because none of them are based on any real facts you can go discover for yourself. But this simply does not apply to atheism. You don't need a specific culture to teach you not to believe in God. All you need is to be born in a place where the carefully curated process for passing along apparently arbitrary cultural insights about God hasn't been maintained. So basically, Mike hears someone say, "You're not likely to learn Christianity in a country where the only religion you're taught is Islam," and his comeback is, "Yeah, well, you're not likely to learn any religion where none are taught." And, yeah, Mike, that's precisely the point. You're just responding to someone telling you how culturally dependent religion is by repeating the same criticism back in different words. So nice job.
Number 3. There was no time before the Big Bang, so that means that there was no time for a God to exist or create things in.
I hate to say it, but I'm not super crazy about this question. While there are potentially some valid points to be made here, simply saying that there was no time for God to create things leaves the door open for the prepackaged retort that God exists outside time. So let's see if Mike manages to hit this easy target.
Now, this objection actually touches on a powerful reason to believe in God. Since the universe is space, time, matter, and energy, then the thing that made the universe needs to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and incredibly powerful. The timeless nature of the origin of all things is another piece of evidence for God.
See, this is just an example of how apologetics gets in way over its head trying to deduce its way to knowledge it has no clue about. If I were to say anything about the origin of the universe, it would be that it probably defies every intuition we have about time and matter. In fact, I'd even acknowledge that my phrasing about it having an origin might be imprecise, because any attempt we make to describe something that far unexplored is going to be riddled with error, even down to the fundamental semantics. But Mike, like most apologists to be fair, goes out of his way to trip over every semantic obstacle he can find. He assumes the universe had to have been made by something, and then describes it as being spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and incredibly powerful. Now I can get how it feels like these traits logically follow. But when you take the step from defies our intuition about time and matter to timeless and immaterial, you've stopped acknowledging that the origin of the universe might be different from anything we know, and started stating in positive terms that it's the mere opposite of what we know. This makes concrete conclusions that, while vague, are still unwarranted, and it invites the audience to start conceptualizing the unintuitive in overly intuitive terms. Once they're primed to do this, you can just start willy-nilly placing inappropriately familiar concepts of the origin of the universe, such as a fully formed conscious being, something we've never seen operate outside the bounds of biology, much less the bounds of space and time, or power in any intuitive form we'd recognize. At this point, you're suggesting a model where the intuitive and unintuitive must interact in a way that makes no logical sense whatsoever. But it won't matter because you can just tell your audience it doesn't have to make sense because God's ways are above ours. So why the charade of logical reasoning to begin with? It's pretty silly and obviously meant to justify religious belief at the extent of all else. Sure, objection 3 might have overstepped by assuming God needed time before the start of the universe, but Mike oversteps even worse by filling this void in our knowledge with even more pretend information.
Number 4. The Abrahamic God cannot exist because it wasn't the first God to be created. There are other gods that have been proclaimed to exist before this God. They can't all be true, so if we can deny the existence of one of these gods, we can use the same method to deny them all.
Once more, Brian is overstating his case by saying this rules out the existence of the Abrahamic God. But even if it doesn't disprove God, it still makes a worthwhile point for Christians to consider. So, let's see what Winger does with it.
This one is seriously confused. It assumes that God was created when Abraham existed, but that assumes atheism to prove atheism.
No, it doesn't. The core issue here isn't the assumption that the Abrahamic God was created. It's that we see other concepts of God arise in human history before the Abrahamic one, which would be kind of strange if it were the real God.
Then it says that if all gods aren't real, then no God is real.
No, it doesn't say that. It says the method you use to deny one can be used against the others. Those are two very different statements.
That's like saying fake Van Goghs prove there are no real Van Goghs.
Yes, your reiteration is like saying that. But the actual point is more like saying that if you own a copy of a Van Gogh and you know an older copy of the same painting exists, then you might suspect yours is a fake one. You shouldn't choose analogies that fall apart this badly once you drill an inch beneath the surface.
Number 5. God either allows the devil to exist and is an accomplice, or it isn't an all-powerful God. An all-powerful and loving God wouldn't allow the devil to exist. Isaiah 45 verse 7, King James Version. Many reasonable explanations have been offered as to why God allows evil.
So would you like to share some of them with us?
And if they are even possibly true, then this objection fails.
But what are they?
And that's why no scholars today promote this objection. On Isaiah 45:7, where it says God created evil,
forget what you claim Bible scholars say, and forget that most of them are invested in Christianity and often have to sign statements of faith. Are you going to share the reasonable explanations you're alluding to?
I have a whole video on that linked in the description below.
So that's a no then. Apparently Mike would not like to share his reasons with us. Instead, he just says a reason exists, well done, sir, and then tells us he's addressed it elsewhere. Which is suspicious. If you actually have an answer, wouldn't you give some succinct explanation before pointing to a rambling hour-long video? It's almost like Mike is hoping we won't watch the video because of how boring it sounds, and instead just assume it provides an answer. But I did watch it. It was incredibly tedious, so you're welcome. And it turns out that video says nothing about why God allows the devil to exist. And I mean literally nothing. The only tangential connection it has to Brian's objection is that it's about the Isaiah passage mentioned at the end. So he just flagrantly sidestepped the issue, but you'd never know it unless you sat through an hour of his content. I think that's why one of his favorite retorts is, "Here, watch this long video I made." It lets him filibuster his way out of conversations because people won't actually watch and he knows it.
Number 6. The God of the Bible is jealous of other gods. This proves that this God is not the only one. With multiple choices only shows that there is no reason to choose just one. If a God were true, there would be no other options. I don't even know where to begin with this one.
Well, then why not just skip it? It's what you did with the last one.
First, if you're taking the Bible as true, which this objection depends on...
No. It absolutely does not depend on the Bible being true. Unless your abstract thinking is so stunted that you confuse discussing the internal logic of a mythology with discussing the actual terms of a god's existence.
Then you realize that these other gods are at worst fake or at best demons and lesser spiritual beings, ontologically nothing like God Almighty.
You rarely hear the word ontologically unless an apologist wants to condescend to you for not playing along when Christianity makes a distinction without a difference.
And number 2, on God's jealousy, since the worship of false gods requires people to treat those gods as if they're real.
But it doesn't require God to confuse the situation by referring to them as if they're real.
By sacrificing to false gods, going to temples, doing sexual rituals, God can be jealous for those people with or without those gods being real.
This is theoretically true and would be relevant to this conversation if we were talking about a passage where God expresses jealousy for fake gods.
Number 3, you're literally taking a warning passage about worshiping false gods and using it as an excuse to reject the true God.
Let's ignore what a piece of trash Winger is choosing to be when he says Brian uses this passage as an excuse to reject God. Instead, I'd like to point out that to do this, he says Brian is literally taking a warning passage about worshiping false gods when that's not what the passage is about. It's literally about worshiping other gods. Now, I can see why Christians would construe this as being about false gods. That's how I coped with it when I was a Christian. But Mike's construence of a passage does not change its literal content. It especially isn't a good reason to chastise someone for making excuses.
Number 7, there is no evidence that spirit energy exists. So we can conclude that psychics, ghosts, and gods are non-existent. Otherwise, God has nothing to be made of. Christianity does not depend on the existence of spiritual energy any more than it depends on the existence of Santa's flying sleigh. God isn't made of something that is part of creation. If he was, it would actually be a good reason to reject belief in God in the Christian sense.
I find Mike's reaction here just incredibly interesting. To determine that something exists, we need to discover the thing, come to understand its properties, and find a way to categorize and label it. In order for any of this to happen, that thing must be detectable. And I challenge you to explain how we detect it if not as some form of matter or energy. And no, concocting logical arguments does not count. No, bad apologists. So I understand the essence of this objection to be that since we've not discovered God in any material sense, there's no reason to believe in him. And spirit energy is just the word Brian used for the substance we start detecting as the first step in the process of discovering him. But Mike responds in 2 main ways. First, he gets distracted by the phrase spiritual energy and laughs it off as being as silly as Santa's sleigh. Forget that the substance of this objection is relevant to Christianity. The phrasing sounds foreign to Christians, so he can dismiss it. This is an interesting look at how much Christian culture is distinguished by the feel of its language versus the uniqueness of its ideas. Second, he scoffs at the idea of expecting God to be made of anything since he's unsubstantial by definition. And sure, I can't expect Mike's definition of God to have any specific attributes. However, I can point out that defining God the way he does gives me no way to investigate his claim, and thus that it's perfectly reasonable for me not to engage with it. If he wants to sit in the corner weaving words that push his assertion of God beyond the range of testability and then laugh at everybody who wants his claim to be more than words, fine. I'm not the boss of how he uses his time, and fortunately he's not the boss of which ideas I have to take seriously.
Number 8, there is no such thing as nothing. For nothing to exist would cause it to be something. Creationists believe that God created the universe out of literally nothing.
I really don't see what this one is trying to get at. There might be worthwhile questions about the Christian concept of God somewhere between the lines there, but it's unclear and seems to rely on the same kinds of semantics apologists try to use against atheism. So I guess take it away, Mike.
Oh my.
Ooh, hang on. Let me try something.
Oh my.
Yeah, it kinda works.
The only people I've actually heard say that nothing is something are atheists. Like, look at physicist Lawrence Krauss, who likes to promote that view.
But they refuse to accept the idea that nothing might be a physical quantity.
I'm personally not that interested in what Krauss says about nothing. I understand it's kind of a controversial idea, and he's speaking as a physicist theorizing on a technical level that doesn't translate well to a layman's understanding of nothing, or to the armchair apologetics arguments that arise from it. So this whole, well, actually, atheists are the ones who believe in nothing, doesn't really get Mike as far as he seems to think it does.
But since we agree that nothing's really nothing, the universe appearing from nothing is powerful evidence for a transcendent creator God.
A highly speculative and easily misunderstood statement from one physicist doesn't mean that we all agree nothing's really nothing. We can't even meaningfully conceptualize that idea, at least applied fully to a literal reality, much less use it to start deducing the mechanism of how the universe got here. That's silly.
Number 9. This is not a finely tuned world created with us in mind. The sun gives you cancer, most of the water's undrinkable, and diseases run rampant. If there was an intelligent designer, there wouldn't be any mistakes. That's like saying that cars aren't fine-tuned driving machines because they can cause car accidents.
Oh, bless your heart, Mike. Okay, think of the things you have to contend with if you want to design a high-speed vehicle. Humans are frail. Sudden impact tends to kill them. Loss of traction or human error can cause a high-speed moving object to go out of control. These were all immutable facts before you started, so by definition your act of design is compensating for them to the best of your ability because you can't change them. None of this applies to God. No similar list of challenges existed when he sat down to create the universe. He would have had to create the list himself by deciding humans would have certain frailties and be subject to certain dangers. And he would have had to invent these frailties and dangers off the top of his head for no reason other than that he wanted to. This makes the idea of him designing anything absurd and gives him none of the excuses fallible engineers have for an imperfect product. Also, think of the tiny space on Earth we can survive in if we struggle and are lucky, and consider by comparison how much of the universe will instantly kill us. Then imagine if that much of a car's interior would kill you. That kind of car seems a lot less designed than one that can get into an accident if used improperly, doesn't it? I think Mike needs to go back to analogy school.
Fine-tuning is present in the universe because the odds are astronomical that any intelligent life could exist without it being just the way it is.
Any intelligent life? Like, have you cataloged every form of life that could possibly exist? I mean, even according to you, God seemed to exist fine without the universe. Is he not intelligent life?
But fine-tuning doesn't mean perfectly safe and without dangers.
Well, yes, it does if the tuning was done by someone who is perfect.
Number 10. Evolution is obviously true. This means that we weren't created by magic and are somehow superior to the animal kingdom. No creator, no God.
Sorry again, Brian, but evolution is about how life diversified, not how it began. So we're a bit off track suggesting it means God didn't create us. I'd usually say the underlying point behind your objection is obvious enough Mike could choose to address it head on instead of nitpicking, but I'm not sure I can fairly expect that of him this time.
Evolution, if you do accept it, is just another reason to believe in God.
So Mike sees someone overstep in one direction, yet instead of taking clear advantage of this mistake, he just immediately oversteps in the other direction. I'm starting to wonder if he's ever seen an opportunity he didn't want to squander.
If an explosion can make all this through natural processes, then it was an explosion that was very highly specialized and engineered by an intelligence that wanted this to happen.
Well, first off, Mike, the universe did not come from an explosion. I mean, good grief. I knew you were bad, but I didn't realize you were Kent Hovind bad. And second, saying the explosion needed to be engineered by an intelligence in order to result in our specific universe is like saying that leaves falling off a tree need to be engineered to end up in the specific pattern they land in.
So that's how I did.
Yep, that is how you did.
Hopefully I defused those 10 issues, 10 proofs before the bomb blew up.
No, it would be more accurate to say someone asked you to defuse a bomb that wasn't even properly rigged to explode, yet you somehow still managed to cross some wires and blow it up. Because sure, Brian's wording was a little rough around the edges, but for most objections at least, he didn't communicate poorly enough to legitimately confuse someone as experienced as Mike Winger. At least 8 or 9 of them alluded to a fundamental issue with Christianity that Mike should have been able to recognize and address. But he spent too little time on that and too much nitpicking issues with some technicality of phrasing or the terms of what Brian was arguing. It came off as obviously evasive, and that's what I found interesting about this video. Apologists are evasive by nature. Their job is to talk their way around problems Christians know exist in a belief they're invested in justifying at all costs. And to do that, they need to develop an instinct to find the easiest way out of a conundrum and take it, regardless of what kind of semantics or excuse-making are involved. So there's something refreshingly straightforward about seeing Mike encounter objections that are meaningful yet phrased loosely enough to give him an easy way to bail out, and then watching him do it in such an obvious way with so little awareness of how petty he's being. The fact that he and Red Pen Logic specifically chose this list from among comments and then treated it the way they did says something about them specifically. But the way they went about it laid out the fundamental workings of apologetics in a really obvious way, and there was something satisfying about watching that. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.